My name is Norman Wirzba, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to this webinar series entitled Facing the Anthropocene. In case you are unfamiliar with the term, the Anthropocene marks the unprecedented moment when some humans became a dominant force in planetary history, responsible for the widespread alteration of the world's land, ocean, atmospheric, and life systems. Though planetary systems and biological processes are still clearly at work, their expressions and effects can no longer be understood apart from human activity. Ranging from the cellular to the atmospheric levels, there is no place or process on Earth that does not reflect humanity's technological prowess and its economic reach. If in previous epochs nature was presumed to dwarf and limit human power, in the Anthropocene the situation is nearly reversed, because now human ambition and power are understood to play a decisive role in shaping Earth's future. The advent of the Anthropocene thus compels a rethinking of multiple fundamental questions, such as, what sort of being is the human being that exerts this outsized power? To what end should this power be directed? And how can we determine when this power becomes irresponsible? Can we think of the sacred? And if so, how? And what sort of world should people endeavor to build together? And what economic, political, and legal mechanisms do we need to get there? It is unlikely that the frames of thought that brought us to this moment are sufficient to help us imagine and implement a better future, which is why now is the time to commit to rigorous probing of the assumptions and the commitments that have and continue to inspire our collective life. And we invite you to join in that questioning when, at the end of our webinar, we will have time to entertain questions from you as a webinar participant. So please enter those questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It is now my great pleasure to introduce today's guest, who is Willis Jenkins. Willis is the John Allen Hollingsworth Professor of Ethics and Chair of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Virginia. He's the author of 2 award-winning books, Ecologies of Grace, Environmental Ethics and Christian Theology, and then also The Future of Ethics, Sustainability, Social Justice, and Religious Creativity, which won an American Academy of Religion Award for Excellence. He's also the editor or co-editor of a number of books, including the Rutledge Handbook of Religion and Ecology. At the University of Virginia, Jenkins is a Global Sustainability Fellow, serves on the leadership team of the Environmental Resilience Institute, and co-directs 3 transdisciplinary environmental humanities labs. Willis, we're delighted to have you here and look forward to your presentation and then the conversation.
Norman, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And thank you for convening this series. And I suppose also to Luce and to the Keenan Center. It really, I have learned so much from people whose work I admire, and it's a real delight to be in this group. So my question is this: how are Anthropocene relations bearing on religion? And how are religious processes shaping Anthropocene futures? As you know, Norman, I began my career interpreting the way Christian traditions could respond to modern environmental problems. Then I started to write more broadly about why religious creativity matters to science-based, culturally pluralist deliberation over sustainability challenges. But the questions raised by the idea of the Anthropocene are broader still, and I've come to realize that the disciplinary modes of thought in which I was trained, religious studies, Christian theology, environmental ethics, are not well disposed to ask them. Even the words I've already employed here, environment, religion, they often divide and lump entangled Anthropocene relations in ways that obscure more than they illuminate. So recently, I have been working with colleagues in sciences and in arts to create transdisciplinary labs in which we try to make better inquiries about the relation of planetary stresses and cultural change. I'll talk about one of those labs today. It's in that context looking for how the skills and knowledges of religious studies can contribute to understanding rapid environmental change, that I raised that lead question: how are Anthropocene relations bearing on religion, and how are religious processes shaping Anthropocene futures? What would it illuminate if we interpreted the powers, crises, experiences summed in the Anthropocene idea as religious? And how might that help us understand the various reworlding responses of communities to those world-questioning pressures? But already I'm being very abstract, so let me illustrate. Sanctuary Lab at the University of Virginia gathers researchers from arts, sciences, and humanities to ask how planetary stresses are interpreted and negotiated from places set aside as special, as sacred in that sense. Some years ago, before the plague, one of our teams focused on Yellowstone National Park. We always involve local experts, and this time that included the climate modeler for the park, Mike Tursek, whom we had asked to give an overview of climate science at Yellowstone. He provided the quantitative overview. However, seeing the scope of our lab's interests, he asked if he could also say something about the implications of his research. Welcome to do so. Tursek quoted Emerson, Thoreau, and Muir to explain that long periods in this backcountry forest are central to his understanding of himself. "I'm not religious," he said, "but I sense a presence here. In the deep wilderness, I feel known and healed. My ego is overcome there." Now, to my way of thinking as a scholar, I would say that Tursek's experience of the Yellowstone wilderness performs religion-like functions of belonging and self-understanding. And that now seems imperiled to Tursek. The highest correlation in North America between climate change and increased fire intensity lies within the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. The data he collects, combined with likely emissions pathways, project that within a few decades, more than 100% of the park will burn every 10 years. Yellowstone is likely to lose all of its forest. Tursek lives with the anxiety of that loss, to the extent, he says, that it makes him feel physically sick. He hikes into the backcountry forest now, and instead of feeling known and healed, he experiences nausea, vertigo, fragmentation. The example suggests that a conventional religious tradition is not required to regard a place as sacred. When the US designated Yellowstone a land that was exempt from economic uses to be enjoyed instead for higher purposes of encountering nature, it authorized a kind of secular pilgrimage of the sort Tursek undertakes. Now, there are all kinds of trouble with the idea of wilderness. I'm not saying it's good religion. I'm suggesting that when we look at it that way, as functionally religious, we can ask, if climate change is putting stress on the experience of wilderness, what is happening to its moral cosmology, to the politics, the norms, the senses of self that it carries? And then we can ask, how will that altered cosmology, those unsettled political norms or senses of self, enter into Anthropocene relations? Religious changes of those kind show up not only in formal belief, but also in patterns of affect. The sort of religion that makes Yellowstone's boundary into a significant threshold shows up not only in beliefs about humanity and nature, but also in the way things feel. Or as Donovan Schaefer argues in his affect-based account of religion, the way our bodies are guided through thickly textured, magnetized worlds. The way the climate scientist's voice cracks when he explains the probable future of the landscape that guides and heals him. Religion-like lexicons often appear in expressions of how the Anthropocene feels, how its strange relations find their way into everyday life. It might be explicit, as in the way that apocalyptic moods are often evoked in discussion of mass extinctions, the dread unspoken, the watchful foreboding, the collective guilt. Or it might be more implicit, as in the ways that everyday talk of the weather becomes inflected with unspoken acknowledgement of uncertain sky powers. Investigating expressions of how the Anthropocene feels is an important reason our teams always involve a researcher from the arts. Arts-based practices of attentiveness, we have learned, can create ways for researchers to walk at once along and askance from the pilgrimage paths of sacralizing traditions, allowing researchers to reflect on those pathways while also opening themselves to experience the landscape that has been enlisted into them. The intentionality of an arts exercise, we have found, compels critical reflection on the mediation of experience, of how a place feels and is variously expressed. I'll return to this at the end with an example. Before we get there, however, let me explain how our lab negotiates three deep perils to organizing research with the Anthropocene idea. First, its species-level vocabulary abstracts from the many lexicons through which particular people interact with particular environments. By focusing on sacred landscapes, we foreground interaction of specific stories with specific places. For example, in Bhutan, our lab focused on Beul, the tradition of hidden valleys in which lie spiritual treasures for those seeking liberation. How does that tradition interpret the forces and powers of global climate relations, including the glacial outburst floods that now menace high Himalayan valleys? Well, the answer is more complicated than time allows here, but let me just note that asking how the Beul concept is being used to interpret glacial floods creates particularizing dissonance with talk of humanity and the climate. Sanctuaries harbor historically specific ways of being human, made through particular relations with more than human worlds. More than ever, we need to understand those many ways of being, at least so that more of us understand how we differently interpret planetary changes, and maybe so that we preserve this lexicon of possible worlds. Against the flat, terraforming vision of the Anthropocene, perhaps we need what Robert McFarlane calls a counter-desecration phrasebook, a glossary of enchantment for the whole earth. And as Rob's work shows, that means getting deep into the ways that landscapes enter into our cultural imaginations. I've been so encouraged and informed by his work. Rob, of course, a participant in this series. A second related liability of Anthropocene discourse is that it conceals inequalities. It can turn attention away from the specific political agents to stabilizing climate and ocean in ways that increase vulnerability for specific beings by talking instead of a natural epic in which humanity in general needs to take responsibility for its actions, probably through some geoengineering or carbon trading that will undoubtedly intensify the advantage of the wealthy, while at the same time further silencing the vulnerable. So the idea of the Anthropocene can be as imperious as the idea of humanity from which it grows, a pseudo-universalism wielded to protect the interests and visions of the powerful while moralizing the diminution and exclusion of all others. Thinking from the coast of Ghana in his recent book, History 4C, Ian Bauckham, formerly of Duke, now of UVA, situates the tension of the Anthropocene within countercurrents of the Black Atlantic between Paul Gilroy's planetary humanism and Achille Mbembe's post-humanist planetary animism. That kind of move is critical, acknowledging the planetary scale of the Anthropocene ideal, while re-articulating its questions from within a tradition of dissent from the dominant Atlantic imaginary, which was made from and for human slavery and plantation ecology. Bauckham traces the difficulty of Anthropocene questions through the Black Atlantic tradition and then asks, where might we look to find models for relations distributed across temporal scales and ontological registers? As our lab prepares a team for coastal West Africa, home to formations of Yoruba, Islam, and Christianity that develop at once within and against oceanic currents of slavery and plantation, we will ask how they incorporate the monstrous scales and mixed ontologies of the rising Atlantic. A third liability of the Anthropocene idea is that it can make it seem that technocratic control over the planet is a natural fact. I admired the way Norman introduced this talk, acknowledging this, as if this really is a full epic of geological history and not, say, a harrowing set of pressures from which might emerge many possible worlds. Think of the Anthropocene, writes Donna Haraway, not as an epic of natural history, but rather as a boundary, a discontinuity, marking a transition between epics. Anna Singh redeploys the biology term Refugia to refer to conditions that provide haven for multi-species relations from the plantation simplification that she takes as a hallmark of Anthropocene pressures. Refugia, she writes, are critical for livable futures, for from them may resurge a diversity of biocultural arrangements. That's one way to understand the Sacred Natural Sites Initiative of the IUCN. Sacred places often protect some marginal set of multi-species relations, even when they're not explicit ecological reserves. Consider sanctuaries as biocultural refugia in that sense, preserving possible futures. For making ways through this discontinuity, we may need sanctuaries to harbor as many possibilities for biocultural resurgence and replenishment as there are sacred stories. My key point in tarrying over these liabilities of the Anthropocene idea is to underscore that religious studies has capacities to critique the organizing discourse while also taking up the cosmological registers, temporal scales, and mixed ontologies that Anthropocene relations involved. That capacity, if offered deftly, should be valuable to teams investigating planetary change and attempting to model pathways of response. But again, I'm not saying that religious words are better ones. Let me return to Yellowstone for a concrete example. Consider the prominence of planetary stewardship as a lead metaphor in major science papers about the human role in an Anthropocene planet. Stewardship borrows on the nobility of Abrahamic ideas of an entrusted responsibility. Now, consider that indigenous peoples were continuously interacting with the high plateau for 9,000 years before it became Yellowstone National Park, and that the Crow people still regard the land as their territory. Until the early 2000s, visitors to the park were told that there was little Native American history there because the tribes were frightened of its thermal features. Against that laughable assertion, research over the past two decades has established that a number of peoples traveled long distances along well-known routes precisely to interact with the unique thermal features of Yellowstone. The settler idea of wilderness as a special place without people has often been a genocidal idea, not only legitimating the expulsion of indigenous inhabitants, but concealing the land's histories. And it is closely connected with the settler idea of stewardship, that only certain people can be entrusted with the land. Now, if a research team unthinkingly frames its planetary change research with a stewardship ethic, it could unwittingly contribute to the implicit idea that the most advanced societies have a noble obligation to take control of ecological systems, while at the same time marginalizing Crow ways of interpreting planetary change. But if the team studying planetary change included researchers who know all the possibilities and liabilities of the stewardship lexicon, like Norman Wirzba, and those who could frame Crow cosmopolitics as also a plausible research premise for thinking about planetary responsibilities, then different research pathways open. A different range of cultural responses can be modeled. My basic theme here, again, has been that religious studies has unique skills for shaping Anthropocene research. There's not time to explain all the ways this kind of research also challenges religious studies, but I conclude now by briefly mentioning two uncomfortable edges of thought for the study of religion. The first is a post-humanist point. We need to learn to study religion without unstated modernist priorities for the human, exclusive of non-humans, or at least exclusive of non-divine non-humans. Religious studies is really good about talking about, gods, but kind of not so great about talking about birds. Like that strangeness is just way too different. For Sanctuary Lab, that means considering how other creatures participate in sacralizing a place. To illustrate, from another one of our sites, the Hula Valley in the headwaters of the Jordan River has become a key stopover for birds migrating between Africa and Eurasia. A marshy wetland drained by the Jewish National Fund in the mid-century Zionist program of land occupation through modernization, part of it accidentally flooded in the late 20th century, and exhausted birds quickly reclaimed it. The National Fund then protected the flooded areas as a bird sanctuary, updating its modernizing claim to the land. The site is now famous among conservationists, many of whom make their own kind of pilgrimage there. You could say that Zionism enlists the birds, but maybe the birds have also enlisted Zionism. They are, for now, collaborators in sacralizing. The birds follow a flyway that traces a tectonic rift from the highland headwaters down the Jordan River, over the Dead Sea, to the Red Sea, taking advantage of the habitats variously protected by religious designations, by militarized security zones, and by ecological sanctuaries. Whatever are the religious and political futures of the Jordan River, they will interact with those migrants, and the birds will try to enlist whatever sense of the sacred is made there. A second uncomfortable edge returns now to the role of arts in research practice. Before we left Yellowstone, the music professor assembled us and handed out instruments, wind and percussion instruments he had made from found items in the landscape. And he invited us to play something back to the land as a gesture of acknowledgement and gratitude. Honestly, it felt weird, but I came to appreciate how participating in this expression of reciprocity compelled us to reflect on how academic researchers ordinarily come into a place and the unstated ontological terms by which we propose to interact with it. As a practice of art, this exercise was not quite religious. It is an offering of respect and relation that was not entirely secular either. It compelled attention to the premises by which we imagine ourselves and our relations. Arts of attentiveness allow researchers to connect disciplined forms of inquiry with an often avoided question. Whose relations convene here, and what kind of claims do they make? I close with that illustration so that I can say, included in the task of the humanities amidst planetary crises, in addition to interpreting cultural responses to those crises and critiquing the ideas and powers fueling destruction and inequality, we also contribute to public understanding of the Anthropocene by creating practices in which to experience and hold the stresses of its fast changing relations. Then the research itself becomes a kind of refuge. Thanks.
All right. Thank you so much, Willis. A lot of really good material for us now to parse out a bit more. I'm struck by some of the words that appear in your presentation, words like sanctuary, refugia. These are words that are deep place words. And yet when we think about how geographers and others, philosophers, sociologists have talked about how one way to characterize our Anthropocene moment is in terms of a general feeling of placelessness, right? Or Marc Augé describes it as a non-placed existence that so many people are experiencing. So could you talk a little bit about how you think this concept of place is functioning? Is it just that some people are really gravitating for a kind of rootedness in place, but for many other people, that's just not the case? I mean, I'm thinking about your description of Tursic, who's been in Yellowstone for a good long while. He's so closely tied to that place that it has a kind of sacred register for him. Mm-hmm. Why is it that so many people either don't have that sense that place matters in this sort of a way, or do you think that there's this yearning for a sense of sanctuary? I mean, how have you been thinking about place in terms of what you're describing here?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Norman, especially because of the real captivating interest in place in environmental thought. And I guess I want to say two things. So on the one hand, place becomes something to attend to. Where, we're being told a story that place matters less and less, right? That whatever's going on in your bioregion doesn't matter so much because of what's happening in, big planetary flows. And that can be both politically and culturally deflating. It erodes the local ways of knowing that people have. And I mean here, modern and traditional and all kinds of non-modern ways of knowing. When you say, well, the real explanation is, some big planetary thing, then all these ways of knowing and talking about and thinking with and from landscapes become simply less important, and we don't think with them. And yet, the story could be true, right? It could still be true that there's those big causal forces out there, and yet that incredible multilingual lexicon that people have developed over millennia could still have a lot of wisdom in it for how to approach these problems and questions. And so, I mentioned Rob McFarlane. I've learned so much, especially, think of just his book Landmarks, which just focuses on all the ways of thinking about just a few places, right? That's been interesting to me. But I want to say the second thing I want to say is what's interesting to me about sacred place, and I think interesting to all of us on the team, is interesting about sacred places that they're often places that do something for the way people interpret the world around them, even if they themselves don't belong there or know much about it. So Yellowstone is a great example because it's an icon of how Americans should interact with and manage nature. So even if you've never been there, you might get super angry about some controversy, right? Like whether or not they should have snowmobiles. Well, Americans all over the country write in about that, right? Because they think it's super important for not just for what goes on in Yellowstone, but for how Americans in general think about their relationship to nature. And I would say there's a similar issue for well, Bhutan generally, but especially the sacred valleys of Bhutan. All kinds of people. Certainly in the North Atlantic, but especially around Asia. Everyone who has any kind of reason to look to Vajrayana Buddhism for some kind of orientation for how it should think about human-environment interactions really cares about what Bhutan does with its sacred valleys, even if they haven't been there or know anything about them.
Mm-hmm. So in your work around place, have you talked much about urban places as being sacred places? And because I'm wondering, what does the language of sacred add when we put it in front of the word place? Because does it mean, like, some of the example like Yellowstone would connote something like wilderness, right? John Muir's cathedral or something like that, right? And for him, there's clearly a misanthropic and also a highly anti-urban thrust in what he's doing. But should we not do that, because urban places then, just sort of, they don't really matter, they don't count, or farmlands don't really count? I mean, this critique.
Yeah, so important, and a real liability in the American environmental thought tradition, where nature is where humans aren't, and so yeah, as you just mentioned, that means we don't have to think about our cities, and also we don't have to think about our farmlands, right? So like, most of the places we live, work, dwell, think, eat, drink, like all that gets exempted. It's and right. Um, um, so let me just say. Absolutely, urban places can be sacred places. However, insofar as they're made special and set apart from the ordinary, right? And so, just so think about in New York, where would you find a sanctuary? Well, those places that are literally called sanctuaries would be a great place, like a church. You enter that space, and whether you share the tradition or not, oh, there's a different order of regard here. It's a different way of being here. And this different way of being is supposed to inform how I return out into the street. And I think that's that's the most immediate available answer to how to think about sanctuary. But I think there are certainly all kinds of ways of thinking about that around the world. And let me just say one more thing, that the Sacred Natural Sites initiative of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature includes a number of these kinds of hybrid places, places that don't look exactly like Americans would think of an ecological reserve.
Yeah. One of the things I liked about your presentation is that you put the focus not simply on the question of ethics, but more deeply on the question of ontologies. What do we take things to be? And in your description of Tursik, for instance, just to use him as one example, there's a kind of familiarity that has developed over his years of working in Yellowstone. There's been habits of attention, but there's also, I think, what you didn't mention as a word, but you sort of hint at with this talk about affection or emotional kinds of responses to the places, is there's a kind of sympathy that develops between Tursik. And that sympathy creates an opening for the world to appear to him in a particular sort of way. And I'm wondering about how this capacity for sympathy develops in people, and what we might be doing as educators, for instance, to try to cultivate this kind of sympathy. I mean, we know from Aldo Leopold that you care for what you love. And if you don't have love, it's very difficult to mount much. But the love is about developing a kind of sympathy that opens a kind of understanding that isn't otherwise available. How do you think about that?
Oh, that's, yeah. I would say the question suggests that you have thought about it more than I have.
Well, I have been thinking about it a lot, because this is where our thinking overlaps in some pretty significant ways. But it's a central question for me, because think about the number of people who go into Yellowstone who have none of the register of affect that Tursik had. I mean, I remember going into the woods once, and it was breathtaking. And we came upon this family. I won't say which city they were from, but it was very evident which city they were from. And the kid was taking a big stick and was beating the heck out of a tree. And I was just astounded. What would possess a person to see a majestic tree and take a stick to start beating it?
Yeah.
So there's that kind of response to a tree is clearly not the kind that you're talking about. So I'm wondering what's happening in the register of sympathy, and what might be done to cultivate.
Yeah, what's so interesting about each of the places that we've saw is that they all have some aspect of that, right? That they're people, not everyone is going to them with some kind of deep openness or some kind of pilgrim veneration or even any kind of real attentiveness. There's all kinds, most of these places are over touristed places, right? They're famous and people go to them because they're famous,
Right.
you know, and they don't really know why they're there. They're there because other people are there. And I guess I think there's also a huge possibility there, right? Like, so that you just like Yellowstone works hard to take this generalized uninformed interest that people have and then take it and educate it into in their case, into, more kind of environmental literacy broadly. And I think what we are doing in our lab is it's not as directly public facing, but it informs public facing work. In that regard, it's to think about what kinds of openings are available from these places. What kind of questions can be hosted from these? In what ways can people be caught out in wonder? I think about Yellowstone with wonder because it used to be called, and still is a little sometimes, Wonderland, which wasn't like go to this place and be open to wonder. It was go gaze upon the wonders. Go take the train out there, get some postcards or whatever, and come back. And there's I think that in each of these places, the folks who manage them, host them, and care deeply for them are in some various way or another trying to take the kind of wonder-seeking way that people dumbly show up and turn it. I think I saw that happening in Bhutan often, where there would be some sacred site, and it's very touristed, local, regional, international tourists, and there would often be often monks who were undertaking some way of inviting people to interact with what's going on there in a deeper way.
Yeah, so I think that's really significant when we talk about going to some of these sacred sites. People show up mostly as spectators or tourists, right? Because that's sort of the way they've been shaped. But when you talk about some of the people that you're engaging that have been in the place for a good long time, and we even use a word like expert. Right? I've been reading about craft tradition and about what craftspeople have to teach us about how we come to understand the world. And one of the things that's very striking is they observe that to the uneducated person who comes into a shop or into a site where craft is being performed, they have no idea what they're encountering. And so the world stays closed to them.
Yeah.
But once you learn how to navigate with particular tools and you work with materials, whether you're making baskets or wood or whatever, pottery, and you come to understand the material by having worked with it over length of years, practice, the world opens up in very particular ways. It doesn't just mean something differently, but there's a kind of sympathetic relationship that happens.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering about whether or not this has implications for the way we think about the education process, where maybe we have to try to figure out ways in which we apprentice people into neighborhoods or apprentice people into places, communities, so that over the length of time and practice, they come to understand a world that has now opened up to them in ways that were closed previously.
Yeah, I so appreciate that. Actually, it puts me in mind of a different project. I spoke here about Sanctuary to kind of this lab project to be able to say some things kind of clearly about the Anthropocene idea. But I'm involved in a different lab at UVA's Coastal Research Center on Virginia's Eastern Shore, which is a mostly rural place with a long tradition of making various kinds of living from the water and the bays. And we've just begun to think together about how humanists, scientists, artists, and local leaders can kind of begin to reshape education for our students at UVA, but also for high school students along the Eastern Shore, to draw them into the watershed as a site of learning. So not just learning, stuff about the watershed, but the watershed really as a community of teachers, human and non-human, including university professors, but not exclusively university professors. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I like your turn towards the end about enlisting artists and practicing contemplative modes of being, because they seem to be doing exactly this, right? To be engaged in some sort of creative enterprise is already to create a relationship or an opening to a relationship with the world around you that you don't have simply as a spectator.
Yeah, exactly right.
And
Exactly
so,
right.
so when
Yeah.
you think about some of the people that you engage from the places that you hang out in, what kinds of things do they tell you that they want you to know
Mm.
and they want you to communicate to people back home when you return?
Yeah, yeah. The folks I've described as, local experts. Sometimes those are like, official scholars, and sometimes they're non-official scholars. Usually it takes a little while for them to figure out just how open our deal is, because we have scientists, and we have, like, religious studies people, and we have arts, but we come from a university, but we have this really broad question. And I would say so far there's been real excitement for it. They're like, yes, this is the scope of question that we want people to ask. It should be this big, right? It should let it help us rethink things. And I think so there's that part, which has been affirming each time. And I guess I would say there's not a consistent message. These are pretty different places, right? And what they want you to take back might be quite different also, depending on their own relation to it. I mean, these are also really contested places, which I didn't have as much of a chance to highlight, but I think probably every sacred place is contested in some way. Places like Yellowstone, you might have, for many non-Indigenous people, you might have to think a moment to realize that it's still a contested place. But you don't have to think a moment to realize that the Jordan River Valley is a very contested sacred site, right? And so yeah, I'm kind of waffling around your question here because I'm interested. Oh, and here's what I want to say about this, Norman. Actually, because it comes back to your craft person question. I mean, you're right that when we come to these places, we find like these incredible people, like Tursek, deeply devoted, knowledgeable, and also has this real technical proficiency in climate modeling. And he's kind of like the analogous craft person, like he's the person you want to learn from. And that in itself would be a great travel seminar, and the analogous people for every place, right? It's just in itself valuable to learn from people who know stuff about a place, and I kind of revel in that, right? Just soak it up. But the real thing we're always after is to find that way that these new planetary stresses put pressure on that, because sacred places are often kind of imagined as places that are exempt from the ordinary pressures. And here the Anthropocene thing is that there's no exemption from climate change. There's no refuge from climate change. And it doesn't matter what story you're telling about your place, it's under pressure, right? So what do you do then? What do you do when you have a divinely protected sacred valley that is vulnerable to a massive glacial outburst flood? We're just interested in, I'm especially taken with that, because it's not just I'm interested in that interpretive act, but then also for what it says for how people are feeling and negotiating and responding to these big world questioning pressures, but doing it still within their lexicon, or maybe through a hybrid, right? A little bit of IPCC and then a little bit of Vajrayana Buddhism, mix it up.
Yeah. So let's shift a little bit here. I've sort of followed your career and have really appreciated your insights along the way. And I've been struck by your turn more towards environmental humanities and a kind of shifting away from some of the traditional theologians that you first engaged, sort of classic figures like Aquinas and Barth and some others. But what have you learned along the way about making a turn towards environmental humanities? Has it been that it's given you a better lens by which to think back upon religious traditions, which historically speaking, we know have often not been allies in any of the sorts around biodiversity protection or things of that sort? How has that worked for you? What have you learned along the way, and what do you think has been a real benefit? And what would you say to religious studies scholars or theologians today that they're missing by staying too much in their silo?
Yeah, good. So yeah, it's true that I began as a kind of normally trained theologian, writing those kinds of expected books. I think as I've shifted to think kind of more broadly about how religious knowledge matters to environmental humanities, and how environmental humanities matters to these broader constellations of thought, I mean, I've really just been asking myself, how is what I know helpful to a community of researchers trying to understand something? And I I never thought it was very convincing, and probably is a little bit polite if I first said, well, first you have to understand why I know this or why I care about it. Like, why? No, I should be able to explain, what I can bring to a question. And as I thought about that more, it changed the way that um, how I interacted with colleagues in the sciences, especially, because one thing I've always been, I think, really compelled by the way that a number of environmental scientists are bravely raising uh, fundamental cultural questions and calling them fundamental cultural questions. We have to rethink the human place in nature. We have to rethink the guiding values. We have to rethink, our ethos. That's big cultural language, right? That's calling for massive transition. And ethics people, religious studies people, humanities people broadly are supposed to be fluent in that kind of thing. And yet, even though, and the Anthropocene has been a huge invitation to that level of thinking. And yet I've often been frustrated with my colleagues in the humanities broadly, let me say, we keep it small ball, right? We like niggle around the edges, and we critique, and we do our historicizing and all that stuff that we're super good at. But it doesn't really help these scientists who are being forced to focus on these big questions, to frame them better, to advance them better, to help them actually make a better model. And if you can't, then just say, okay, fine, you can't. And when I realized, like, oh, I can't, I was like, okay, I need to retool a little bit. Not because I think religious studies doesn't have the capacities and the tools. Like I've said today, I think it has really important ones that can actually help reframe some of this broader research questions. And I've been so excited at UVA to be part of teams that do that. And I'll just say the Environmental Resilience Institute has been a real supporter in that. I mean, real open to the involvement of the humanities. And so I would just say to people who are training in theology and religious studies, or people who are already excellent in theology and religious studies, that just recognize the quasi-theological questions that are being raised by our colleagues around us, and ask how we can interact with them in a way that doesn't, I would say, this is what's been important to me, that doesn't have an identity-based justification for it. Like, no, you should listen to me because I'm whatever, or you should listen to me because I know stuff about a group that's politically powerful. I mean, yeah, okay, that's important too, and it's good to know that stuff. But like, is it intellectually interesting in and of itself? Can it help you illuminate the question? Can it help you understand how communities and publics are using the cultural inheritances that they have very broadly, and advance them, make them better?
Yeah, no, that's really good. I noticed earlier in your presentation, you mentioned how religious traditions are often really good about talking about non-human beings called gods, but not so good about talking about birds, right? And I think, in traditions that I've worked in, there's also been a real otherworldly emphasis. And so it seems to me that we're in this very unusual space where there's so much to be learned in terms of the kinds of questions that have been implicit or explicitly addressed within religious traditions, but
Yeah.
owing to some features in modernity or varying institutional expressions of these traditions,
Yeah.
those sorts of questions have just been erased. And
Yeah.
and I think you're right that we're in this moment now where these fundamental questions are being raised by all sorts of people in a quasi-theological way. And I really appreciate the way you put that. Let's turn now to some questions from some of our participants. To what degree do you wait? The question moved here. To what degree do you find concepts of sacred and secular even helpful? Are the terms useful in describing places and things themselves, or are they recognition of creatures' postures toward them? Another way of asking this is sacredness something that is always present everywhere and is only then either recognized or ignored?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Um, I would say, so first of all, I'd say that ideas of religion or the sacred that depend on a contrast with the sacred, yeah, they're kind of less and less useful. And I think one of the reasons why is because folks are realizing more and more that what we take as like common sense secularity is in itself its own set of metaphysical assumptions about which relations you can interact with and who you can listen to and all those sorts of things. And I think, many scholars in the humanities would agree with that. And I also appreciate the notion there that calling something sacred, maybe it's not so much a description of what it is, but a description of how people regard it, and maybe that regard is an artifice of some kind. There's a tradition in religious studies around the study of sacred landscapes that kind of oscillates between sacredness as something resident in the place as being super special, or sacredness is just a kind of projection on it, or sacredness is a kind of, phenomenological experience of a place as being describable as sacred. I guess I would incline more to the latter, but what I'm really interested in is just the move by which many communities do something like set apart something as interpretively special. And maybe it doesn't line up exactly as sacred in the way that Western religious thought would think about it, but there's this move to think about some part of our reality or experience as interpretively and authoritative for another part. And I'm really interested in just what that move does for how we then think about these new big quasi-theological questions.
Yeah, that's really helpful. And your use of the word authority that you just snuck in there, I think, is a really interesting one to parse out a bit more, that a place will come to have power over a person. So Tercy talks about the sense of overwhelming or being reoriented or resituated as a human being. And that would suggest that there's almost something not interpretation free, but nearly natural or inevitable insofar as people come to be more closely tied to places. Could we say that? Or is that going too far to say that there's something that would just happen if people paid attention?
Well, the reason I just smiled is that what made me think about coming back to Tersic is the way that for him, the authority of Yellowstone is self-disclosing. And without trying to explain that away, like I want to affirm that is real for him, especially for him, and for many people who share in that tradition. And I am one of them to some degree, despite the things that I said about the wilderness tradition. Like, it has a claim on me. But also that what religious studies scholars are good at is seeing that move of the concealed self-disclosure of authority. Like, we're pretty good at being able to understand how the logics of authority work within traditions of interpretation. And I think that's an important skill right now.
Yeah, that's good. Another question: what do you think are the political implications or possibilities of thinking of places, wilderness, in these ways that touch on sacred? Coming to the question of authority from a different perspective, we might say.
Yeah. So I think, and I hope, that one basic political implication is, I think I want to put it this way. Well, it's very clear that we need planetary responsibilities, that we don't need a single planetary story about humanity and nature, and that would probably be bad. Being able to reclaim all of our ways of being in particular landscapes, ways of being in particular ecological flows, knowing ourselves through them. I think that in itself, I guess that's upstream of politics a little bit, but I think it's politically significant. I'm gonna say the one other thing then, I mentioned a bit with stewardship. I mean, notice the ways that when we have big pan-regional or planetary plans to deal with these very significant problems that we have, and we go to look for that lead ethical metaphor, maybe human welfare or stewardship or whatever, like that's an ethical metaphor, and it's important to know the cultural inheritances from which it's derived, and what it can do and what it can't do, and what the alternatives might be, what it does, how it puts other people from other traditions in a certain kind of posture. I mean, it's just important to know all that. And I think so I would say, politically, it's always true that our political representatives could be better with religious fluency, and that is true also for our would-be Anthropocene managers.
Yeah, and at least broaden out who's being represented in democratic deliberation, right?
Yeah.
Another question: in what ways can we think about sympathy or empathy with other than human creatures while avoiding pitfalls of projection? self-satisfying fictions regarding what other animals do, feel, think, experience, so forth?
Oh yeah, such a good question. It's such a lively intellectual scene right now, in what's sometimes called multi-species studies, but also in ethology. I mean, there's just a lot of work, a lot of really important empirical and theoretical work about the extent to which human minds can know the experiences of non-humans, or know about their way of being in the world, I would say. And then also, lots of, I'd say, renewed interest in non-modern ways of knowing the non-human. I think because many people who grew up with modernist common sense have come to think that maybe it's not as sensible after all. And so I want to say that there's a lot of really careful scholarly work about that. In a separate project, I've been working with Stefan Scrimshire, Jeremy Kidwell, and some folks in Europe on and Kate Rigby from this series is in it as well, on mass extinctions. And so I've been reading through this research a fair amount, and I just want to say, mass extinction is, it's one of the hardest things for me to write and think into, and it's just really tough, right? But one of the I guess, I don't know what, it's not exactly a silver lining, but something that's happening is there's a lot of great intellectual rethinking about what we know and how we think about what we know of other creatures. A lot of rethinking about species. And I guess there's if there's two things I want to hold out from that, one is think about how much research that comes out now on the front page of papers, saying, hey, look, it turns out that fish feel pain, or whatever dogs think, or something, and it's a discovery. Well, what an achievement of cultural ignorance that we would have to relearn something that most humans of all time have known, right? Like, what went into that ignorance? And I think that's the first thing to investigate. So I guess I've shifted the burden of proof in my own thought, instead of like, am I projecting, to instead like, what am I ruling out or disqualifying as knowledge because it doesn't line up? And then the second thing I'd say is something that David Abram has said, that I've appreciated. He talks about how much of this research about what other species know and think is really focused on this internalist model of the self. So I think I navigate by doing this. Well, how does a bird navigate? It's like, well, don't think about the knowledge of a bird as just inside the brain of a bird. The knowledge of the bird is suffused through all its migratory relations. And Tim Ingold has ways of thinking about this as well, non-internalist ways of thinking about intelligence and experience.
And David
I'll stop there.
done that with trees too, talking about
totally
systems. Yeah, which is also just fabulous once you start thinking and not in these sort of cognitive STEM ways. New ways of thinking about intelligence more broadly open up, which is just really, really great. Another person asked about the relationship between aesthetics and ethics. Does aesthetic experience open up possibilities for ethical responsibility with respect to nature?
Yeah, I think so. And I mentioned briefly this project that we have at the Virginia Coast Reserve, and a really key moment for me is when I was able to partner with a music professor, Matthew Bertner, who's my co-director in this, along with the scientific director of the reserve. And I think what the three of us discovered together was that when you think about, when I as an ethicist think about how to integrate ethics into a science-based program, the kinds of things I think of are kind of boring and not likely to be very culturally effective, but what we ended up doing something is, let me give you an example of something we ended up doing. We sonified the long-term data sets of coastal change at the Coastal Research Center. Then we created a musical performance that included those sonified data sets. And they didn't have like a one-to-one correlation, like, this change means this thing, but everyone who was present knew that the science was informing the artistic expression. And you could tell that it opened folks' mind in a way that was way more creative and engaged than if I had given them a lecture on the, I don't know, implications of justice and responsibility or whatnot, so that's just to say a hearty yes to that question. Absolutely. There's a real role for those of us in the humanities and in the sciences to work more carefully with artists who know how to frame aesthetic experience.
Well, that's really great insight. And can you talk a little bit more, just pushing this a little further, about how has aesthetic experience affected the scientists that you've been working with?
Yeah.
Do they think about the scientific enterprise somewhat differently
Hmm.
when there are artists coming along in the
Yeah.
conversation?
Yeah. Well, again, I'll just plot it to our co-director Karen McGlathery, the lead scientist for this coastal research station. And I'll tell you a funny story. When we did a pilot project, the music professor and I, to kind of see if this was going to work, and we told her we wanted to do this, and it was her and then also the chair of religious studies at the time, Curtis Schaefer, is co-director with me and Martine Halverson Taylor of Sanctuary Lab. We all went out, and Matthew said, okay, we're each going to do some individual attentive listening at a certain site here, at a research site on the coast. And so here's your headphones, go out, come back in 30 minutes. And I was just sweating. I was like, oh, no. Like, the chair of religious studies is this hardcore philologist. He's going to think this is totally dumb. The scientist is going to be like, this is exactly what happens when you invite the humanities. This kind of squishy, weird stuff happens. Like, get me back to something serious. And Karen came back, and she took up headphones and she said, every one of my scientists needs to do this. And the reason was because she said, I went out there thinking I would be bored, that I know everything about this place. And I experienced it in a new way. And I observed things that I hadn't observed before. And I realized that she said, what the word she used was empathy, that it made me empathetic with the place in a way that I hadn't been before. And the empathy can be really important even for research design of new ways of thinking. And so yeah, it has changed the way that some of the scientists involved think about their research.
Yeah, that's a great story. I think we got time for one more. You argue that religious studies has the capacity to disrupt the organizing discourses of the Anthropocene. But then when we look at how religions have actually worked to uphold those discourses and maybe even establish them, what do we do with that?
Oh yeah, I mean, again, religion is not necessarily good. I mean, so by religion, I mean a category of analysis, a way of seeing a certain kind of cultural activity. And I think and part of that, I kind of emphasize the hopeful side here. I think the other side of that is there, of course, absolutely, there are all kinds of religious formations who are involved in destructive and unjust Anthropocene powers. And I think that, the other side of this is that religious studies scholars in particular, but folks of all sort, need to be better actually at critiquing that. And one of those would be, I would say, the fossil fuel subsidy for certain kinds of religious formations, and then the recursive legitimation of fossil fuel energy from those formations. And that's not just white US evangelical Christianity, although great job, guys, you're certainly doing it. But also there's the kind of the relationship between Russian Orthodoxy and contemporary natural gas, the relationship between Wahhabi Islam and fossil fuels. I mean, these are really powerful currents, not just of those religious memberships and their institutions, but then also the legitimating political discourses that come out of them. And I think that's a huge area for future research.
And do you find that in your own department with religious studies, do you have colleagues who resonate with this kind of questioning and seeing how the Anthropocene opens up a new way to do a kind of self-analysis of traditions?
I mean, I'm the chair of the department, but I got to tell you, I love my department. I mean, yes, so much so, and I'm so grateful to work with my colleagues, the former chair and associate chair, who I was worried when I was hired in an environmental humanities position that they thought what I did was kind of silly, and now we work together on this sanctuary lab. And they've created amazing podcasts. Check out their Sacred and Profane podcast, that a number of which have environment related and energy related themes to them. And we have great young faculty doing stuff on Islam and science, Hinduism and environment, Chinese religions and environment. So, I see a lot of young scholars, not just at UVA, but I see a lot of young scholars in the Guild broadly working on these kinds of questions.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Willis. It's been great to have you on this webinar with us. And thank you to participants for joining us today. Next week will be our very last webinar, and I will be the speaker at this event. And so we invite you to join us for this closing webinar. So again, thank you, Willis, and wish all of you a good afternoon.
Thank you, Norman.